Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's very timely webinar, The Return of Donald Trump and Expectation for U.S.-China Relations. We are pleased to welcome our esteemed panelists and all of you in the audience who represent a broad range of backgrounds and expertise. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the DC-based think tank, the Institute for China American Studies. So ICAS focus a lot of issues affecting or concerning the U.S.-China relations for many subjects and fields. As we observe, Donald Trump's return to the central role of the U.S. polity has already, and it's going on, sparked a lot of discussion about what this could mean for the future of the bilateral relations. During his first term, the U.S.-China relations experienced very significant shift marked by heightened tension over the trade, over the technology, and also national security. Trump's policy have left a very lasting impact on both countries' strategic priorities, and his re-emergence raised important questions about the trajectory of the relationship moving forward. So today, we are very honored to have two esteemed panelists to join us today to discuss and analyze the potential implication for the new Trump administration. We have Professor Robert SUTTER from International Affairs at the Illinois School of George Washington University, and Professor Zhu Zhiqun from the Professor of Political Science, International Relations at Bucknell University. They will explore possible direction of U.S.-China policy and among other issues, including the challenges and opportunities in managing these relations. And then this session will be monitored by my colleague, Mr. Sarah Gupta. He's the Senior Fellow and also head of ICAS Training Technology Program. So I look forward to the very productive and insightful session. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you, Nong, and good morning and good evening to all of you all. Looking forward to a great discussion. There's so much to discuss. I am not going to take up time out here. Let's get directly into the conversation with regard to what might and might not happen over the next 4 years with Donald Trump and the Trump administration and US and China. We have to remember that it was the Trump administration which made a marked change in the US national security strategy in December 2017 and labeled China as a revisionist power and that we were in a new era of great power competition. And since then, US-China ties have really been turbulent. Over the past 15 months, there has been a sort of rough and ready stability, but it's again up to Donald Trump to make the decision whether he would like to continue with that stability in ties or whether he would like to go in a different direction. More questions than answers. Let's get straight to our panelists. The way we will work today is we will have both Professor Sutter and Professor Zhu speak initially for about 10 to 12 minutes. Professor Sutter will talk about how might US policy change with regard to China, also some of the elite views in the region in Asia as to how their reception to the election results here. Professor Zhu will go next with regard to how China views the change of administration in Washington, its fears, anxieties, hopes, etc., etc. And then we'll break out into a discussion phase and end with Q&A. We will stop sharp at about 10:58 p.m., which is 58 minutes, 53 minutes from now. Without any further ado, Professor Sutter, the floor is yours. Please go right ahead.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I have three basic things I'd like to do in my time. First, give a few points about the Indo-Pacific countries and the U.S. election debates and how they reacted to that. And the second thing is about the implications of that for the region, the elections themselves, and how the region thinks about it. And then look at anticipated changes coming from the Trump administration and their implications. So first on the U.S. election debates. Remember, in this election, foreign policy was almost last as the main issue. It was very low. And Asian issues were even hardly mentioned, except for China. China was the exception. But there was no heated China debate. Many people anticipated that. That didn't happen. because there's this broad consensus among policy circles in Washington on how to deal with China. There were differences between the two candidates that were quite significant in dealing with allies and partners. So Mr. Trump and candidate Harris, they were very different on that, and the two trends are obvious to all that the Biden-Harris team really relied on allies and partners and nurtured the relationship, and Mr. Trump has a long reputation of not valuing them very much. And then there was a difference of degree on tariffs, but it was a difference of degree. This protection, what's seen in the region as a protectionist trend, this continues and is bipartisan. And so they don't like that, but that seems to be a reality here in the United States. So the reactions to the region, it's quite interesting. This is based on our work I did with the East-West Center, putting out a report on October 29th on Asian reactions to the election debates. And so I focused on 10 different Indo-Pacific countries. Basically, there were no positives seen in the U.S. positions. Everything was, how do we manage the negatives rather than the positives we're going to gain from this? And there's a great deal of uncertainty and angst in the region. This is something that's brought on by a lot of different factors: globalization, anti-globalization, authoritarianism, democracy. These kinds of push them in different directions. Plus, the U.S. China competition overlays a lot of these sort of things. And so these kinds of concerns were exacerbated by the election. And what you find is a certain amount of angst, I would call it, anxiousness about the uncertainty, pervasive uncertainty and anxiousness about it in certain places, not all of them, as far as the election results were concerned. And the key ones are Taiwan and the Philippines. They were the most concerned about this. They're on the front line in dealing with China. They rely on the United States. If the United States shifts its policy in some way, that could work to their disadvantage. And of course, they're integrated economically, in Taiwan's case, very much with China, and tariffs will have important implications for them. And we also found South Korea was concerned. There was a lot of concern in South Korea, less concern, but still some in Japan, for the same sorts of reasons that I've just laid out. And what they worry about is the tariffs. They worry about a possible deal with China that the Trump administration might carry out that would jeopardize Taiwan and jeopardize the security as they see it in the region. These are the kinds of things that they're concerned about. Australia was not very concerned. They felt confident. They had dealt with Trump effectively in the first term, and they could do it again. And then in ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, you find most of them are hedging, and the hedging strategy sort of works in this case. And so they're not terribly anxious. Singapore was anxious about the longer term, what this meant for U.S. strategy in the region. Would the U.S. become disengaged from the region? And then just a couple of points about China. Professor Zhu will cover China for our group. But China wasn't anxious. China was very negative about both candidates, and they basically saw the rivalry with the United States continuing, and that they were ready for it or getting ready for it. And there were no compromises seen in China about this sort of thing. And some emphasized the need for stability, like the leader of China has emphasized this. And so that suggested that Harris, while they didn't like a lot of things that she was doing from China policy point of view, she was a preferred, she was stable. She was going to be good for stability. And Trump was erratic and volatile and very disruptive in many cases. And so they were more negative in that regard. Okay, so let's take a look at what anticipated Trump administration actions and their implications. There are a few positives here. It's mainly negatives, looking at negatives here. And so, number one, more tariffs. And this will lead to greater disruption and restrictions on export restrictions and things of that type. All of that is widely anticipated. And I think that's accurate. But there are offsetting things here that are acknowledged in many cases. In other words, the countries, if the companies, the U.S. companies, even Chinese companies, If they want to avoid the U.S. tariffs, they can relocate in other places in the region that can work to the benefit of places like Vietnam and Malaysia and others. And so, and the other thing is that Trump is almost certain to get his tax cuts confirmed. And if he gets his tax cuts confirmed, we're going to have a boom in this country for about a year. We're going to be buying all sorts of stuff, and I think this is something that that will benefit the region as well. Not necessarily long term, but short term. But in general, no positives there. And then the second thing that's anticipated, you'll have less positive attention, you'll have less close consultations with allies and partners, you'll have more demands on key allies and partners regarding trade balances and military preparedness. The implications of this, when you combine them with the disruptions seen in the tariffs, are that these countries might feel they have to look for other areas to help them, that relying on the United States is not such a good option. What exactly they'll do in this angst-ridden arena of uncertainty, that's very uncertain in my judgment. But it is something that does concern countries about in the region that are close to the United States. Is the U.S. disengaging? Is it no longer concerned about being a leading power in Asia? And obviously, some observers in China thought that was great. You know, that was, well, not great, but a good thing, that the U.S. Would be disengaging and China then would rise in accordance with that. The Trump senior appointees, and then the third point is that Trump's senior appointees and the and the bipartisan majorities in Congress favoring this tough hardening of American policy toward China. It's been going on now for over 6 years. This makes the forecast say, well, that's probably the way the Trump administration is going to go. And tariffs will come first, I guess, and that will be, yes, in line with this. But there's a caveat here. And this caveat, I think, is quite important, and particularly to Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan. And the caveat is that Mr. Trump is transactional, as well as being, you know, other things. And he may see an advantage in negotiating with China over trade and Taiwan and other differences. And the evidence in this is suggestive of this, and it's fairly significant, it seems to me. Mr. Trump is highlighting positively his past negotiations with Xi Jinping. Publicly, he's doing this. He's the only senior policymaker in the United States that says positive things about the Chinese leader, and he does it all the time. And so what is this all about? And he dumps on Taiwan all the time, and as well as South Korea and others. And so so the point here is that there may be a deal, and this does concern privately people in Taiwan, privately people in South Korea, and privately people in the Philippines. This does concern them. That if it makes a deal with China, and it could be detrimental to Taiwan. That would just undermine the whole strategic framework in the region from their point of view, and would be very negative for them. And so the regional implications of this are what? Well, what do you do under those circumstances? I mean, and what you find is that a lot of the uncertainty in the case of Taiwan and the Philippines and South Korea is that their governments represent one wing of the political arena in those countries. The other wing favors a different approach. They favor a more moderate approach to China. They favor less commitment to the United States. And so that makes the situation even more uncertain as to where they will go. But the bottom line here is that if the U.S. makes a deal with China, well, then maybe other countries would have to say, well, maybe we should be making a deal with China too. And that could lead to a situation that would erode America's leading position in the region significantly. So that's the outlook that I see at this point. And I'm a big believer of Biden's creating positions of strength and building allies and partners. And so personally, I regret that that's happening, that's predicted to happen. And I'm hoping that it will survive this period. And I think that for a strategic point of view, many people in the administration probably will understand the need for allies and partners, but Mr. Trump is a different orientation and he's a very powerful president. So I'll stop here and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Sutter. Very interesting. Thanks for keeping us updated on the views from the region. I think that's very, very important. It's interesting that's the smaller allies, which are the ones who are the most concerned. And you also raise a really interesting point too with regard to Mr. Trump and the Trump administration, and those might be two very different quantities in terms of how they approach China, especially being transactional, Mr. Trump, and but many of his appointees being a lot more hawkish, and how that will play itself out. Anyway, thank you very much. Professor Zhu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you, Dr. Hong, for having me here today. I appreciate your invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to share a panel again with Professor Bob Sutter, a great friend and mentor. So following Bob's overview, I'll just add maybe 3 points. First, as Bob mentioned, I think Trump's priority will be domestic. For average Americans, foreign policy has never been a major issue during elections or in their daily lives. Before this presidential election, and the opinion poll group YouGov actually did a survey asking American voters which foreign policy issues are most important to you. Out of a list of 10 foreign policy issues, relations with China is ranked number 8, behind the Israel-Palestine conflict, terrorism, human rights, Ukraine war, cybersecurity, defense spending, and international alliances. Number 8. Not sure if we can ever trust those opinion polls again, but still, I think Trump's victory shows once again that domestic politics dominated the 2024 presidential election. Trump's priority will be to fix urgent domestic issues, such as getting the prices down, creating more jobs, and dealing with the illegal immigrants, as he promised. Even on foreign policy, I don't think China is the priority. Trump needs to, as he's promised, to end the Russia-Ukraine war first, and then the ongoing conflict in the Middle East also requires his immediate attention. So that's my first. Second point, what's the implication of Trump's victory for China? As Bob also mentioned, of course, it's mostly negative, perhaps all negative in China, right? I don't think the Chinese government was looking forward to this election because either Harris or Trump is going to be a challenge for Beijing. And both parties, or both candidates consider China as a threat to U.S. national interests and will counter China's growing power and influence. So in general, many Chinese believe that it does not really matter who is in the White House, who will be the next president, because they're going to be tough on China anyway. With Trump's return to the White House, however, most analysts in China feel very pessimistic about the future and predict a sharp deterioration of the bilateral relationship. We all know Trump loves tariffs. He said tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. It seems that he truly believes that tariffs can fix all the trade and economic problems. So in his second term, the trade war, especially the tariff war, will almost certain to continue and likely escalate. China, of course, is struggling with a weak economy now. So high tariffs will accentuate China's domestic problems and hit China's economy real hard, especially those companies relying heavily on exports. So that's really bad news. However, I want to also highlight some positive side. Xi Jinping actually sent a congratulatory message to President-elect Trump and called for a healthy, stable relationship. And also, it's notable that a few weeks ago, before the election, Xi Jinping sent a letter to the National Committee on U.S. China relations saying that China is willing to be friends with America, which suggests that he's prepared to work with whoever wins the U.S. election. And Xi's meeting with Biden in Lima, Peru over the weekend reconfirms that China wants to maintain stability in the relationship and is ready to work with President Trump again. Trump, for his part, often speaks highly about Xi Jinping. He talks about his good relationship with Xi Jinping. He has said that he wants China to do great. So I think unlike some of the folks who served in his first administration and some of the folks he just nominated for his second administration, Trump himself, we can say, is not a China hater. So these are some positive signs. Perhaps the two leaders will meet soon after Trump takes office and talk about trade and other issues. And you never know, maybe they can reach a deal and the trade war can be avoided. So to a great extent, I think that the ball is really in Trump's court. It's up to him to decide the degree to which he wants to stabilize or destroy the U.S.-China relationship. Trump is still forming his new administration. So far, not so good for China, right? The combination of Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, Robert Lighthizer, Stephen Miller, and John Ratcliffe, right? The combination of these folks, does not bode well for the U.S.-China relationship. These people form some sort of a tough on China dream team. So I think Beijing will have to be have to fasten its seatbelt now. And of course, it also depends on whether Trump will micromanage U.S.-China relations or whether he will just let his key cabinet members take care of the China policy. If he micromanages relations with China, probably not too bad. He will take advantage of his relationship with Xi, and maybe they can strike a deal. And of course, not all news is bad news so far. Although a second Trump term is generally regarded as bad for China's exports, I read in the news that one region in China seems to be celebrating. That is EU. EU, the giant commodity wholesale market, not too far from Hangzhou. Orders for various Trump-themed merchandise have gone through the roof. You go to the Amazon.com and you will realize that most of the MAGA products, including the red MAGA caps, are made in China. And of course, there's Elon Musk. It's interesting to see if and how Musk can serve as sort of a guardrail for the deteriorating relationship. Also, who will be the next U.S. ambassador to China? Will Trump send somebody to Beijing to pick a fight with the Chinese or help smooth the relationship? I think we'll have to wait and see. And finally, members of Congress from agricultural heavy states may still wish to have a normal trading relationship with China, including South Dakota Senator John Thune, the new Senate Majority Leader. After all, China remains a top export destination for U.S. agricultural products. Before I end my second point, I also want to raise a question here. What does Trump's win mean for Chinese Americans in the United States? I think Chinese Americans here worry that the notorious China Initiative may be resuscitated to persecute Chinese American scientists and others on dubious accusations. And new McCarthyism and racism may be on the rise again. And Asian hate crimes may also jump up. That's really a major concern of many Asian Americans I know of. Now, my third point, looking ahead, what could happen in the next few years between China and the United States? Well, we all know China survived Trump 1.0, so it probably can survive Trump 2.0. I think the Chinese will have to be flexible and take proper measures as the situation calls for. We all know that three issues dominate the U.S.-China relations now and into the near future. The three T's, basically: trade, technology, and Taiwan. We know that Trump and his advisors most likely will impose high tariffs on China as their way to fix America's economic problems. and perhaps hoping to bring China to its knees. But we need to look at China, what China will do. We can look at China's toolbox to make some predictions. First, I think China probably can retaliate in kind, such as imposing high tariffs on U.S. exports to China, especially agricultural products to China, hurting Trump's support base, those agricultural states, basically. And then China can also restrict export of certain critical minerals, such as rare earth materials that are critical for the semiconductor industry here. The China can also work with U.S. allies and partners to push back the tariff war, because nobody likes the tariff war, and especially U.S. allies and partners in Asia are really anxious, as Bob just mentioned. Finally, perhaps China can appeal to the very few reasonable and moderate voices within the U.S. and educate Trump officials that tariffs actually hurt American consumers. I know this last one probably is a very tall order. We know that China is already consolidating its own network of friends and allies through such multilateral forums as BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Xi Jinping himself has been traveling around the world to promote multilateral cooperation. And I think China will continue to promote a multipolar international system. We can see China is emphasizing the role of the global South, including improving relations with India recently. And China is reaching out to U.S. allies individually to break up the anti-China alliance. Relations with Australia, Japan, South Korea, and major European countries are showing signs of improvement as we speak. And most U.S. allies do not like the tariff war, so that opens the door for China to work with these countries. And when the U.S. market has become unfriendly, China is diversifying its exports to different regions. For example, China and ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, are each other's largest trading partner now. And their trade will continue to grow. And Xi Jinping is still in Latin America now, don't forget. Trade is expected to grow between China and the Latin American countries. Chinese investment in Latin America is also expected to grow, including new mega infrastructure projects and joint ventures to manufacture consumer products here in Latin America. In other words, China may be able to circumvent the high tariffs, and Chinese goods may still enter the US markets through other countries in Latin America or Southeast Asia or elsewhere. Now, on technology, I think the high-tech war will continue. Export ban to China will stay. High tariffs on Chinese EVs and sanctions on Chinese high-tech companies such as Huawei will continue as well. Interestingly, Huawei's revenue has been growing. It has moved on and become more powerful and generating more profits, not only expanding its markets globally, but also sharpening its technologies to invest in new businesses such as EVs and education. So this war against the Huawei apparently has not succeeded. The US high-tech war with China actually has compelled China to invest more in research and innovation. So in a sense, the US tech war has incentivized Chinese businesses to be more innovative. Today, I think China already has a commanding lead in several areas, such as EVs, solar panels, and lithium batteries. Now, finally, on Taiwan, I think members of Congress will continue to advocate robust support for Taiwan, sometimes in ways that seem designed to provoke China. However, these impulses to support Taiwan and confront China now have to compete with rising isolationism within the US government, especially within the Republican Party, as evidenced by intra-party disagreements over US aid to Ukraine. And this year, actually, the Republican Party platform did not mention Taiwan for the first time since 1980. So Trump himself has showed no interest in Taiwan. His aversion to war actually aligns with China's interest in pursuing peaceful reunification with Taiwan. So under Trump, a U.S.-China war over Taiwan is perhaps less likely. So in conclusion, overall, I think the relationship between China and the United States is not going to be smooth in the next 4 years, especially on the economic front. We're not sure what the Trump team will exactly do to China, but we already know that China does not want to see this relationship completely broken. The phrase the Chinese like to say is 斗而不破. It really captures the Chinese overview of the bilateral relationship in the next few years. 斗而不破 basically means that the two sides will continue to compete and struggle with each other, but they're not going to break this relationship because everyone know that the stakes are too high. So I will stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zhu. Let me shoot out some rapid fire questions to both of you all, and so we can cover a number of topics. A question I'd like to ask both Professor Zhu and to Professor Sutter. Let me go with Professor Zhu first. Same question. You talked about on the list of priorities, China was way down, pretty low down on that list. And in that context, the question is, looking over the longer arc of what was called the pivot, in the first Obama administration, and the goal was to kind of bureaucratically shift the mindset and the focus of the US government on foreign affairs towards the Indo-Pacific and obviously compete and contest China. With all the wars happening, particularly Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East, engaging US attention so much, where does the pivot or that focus on the Indo-Pacific stand in the larger scheme of things, particularly with the Trump administration coming into office? Professor Zhu?
Okay, I'll be brief. So yes, I think the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy will under challenge because we know that Trump doesn't favor multilateral approach. So if he returns to this sort of unilateral or isolationist approach, then obviously this Indo-Pacific strategy, this pivot, Quad, these things the role of these things will diminish, weaken to a great extent, and U.S. partners and allies in the region will also feel anxious. They don't know what Trump will do. So that may be good news for China. That's why I mentioned that China probably will take advantage of Trump's foreign policy reorientation and reach out to U.S. allies and partners. And we can predict that China's relations with U.S. allies and partners will actually improve in the next few years. And you already see that happening, with India, Japan, and South Korea, Australia. I think, yes, from a U.S. perspective, this pivot, especially Indo-Pacific strategy, probably will suffer in the next few years.
Professor Sutter?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I disagree a little bit with this. I don't like the equation of Obama's pivot and what's the Indo-Pacific strategy, for one thing. This is very serious business now. This is a national consensus on this issue in China. China is a threat, and that's so widely held now that you're just not going to ignore that. You can't ignore it because China keeps coming. Because basically, as Professor Zhu mentioned, the challenges are in clusters. There's so many challenges coming from China, and we keep finding new ones. And so as we keep finding new ones, and people are re-energized to build defenses against it. So I think that pattern is going to continue because the Chinese do have all these mechanisms that they use. Their toolbox is really big, and they do these things, and therefore I think this is going to remain a danger. Second point is that the MAGA people are full of people who want to pull away from Ukraine because they want to focus on China. China is an exception from so many of these MAGA people in Congress anyway. They want to take resources that we would put into Ukraine and put them into dealing with China. And so I think that's the second thing. The third thing is I think in the Republican Party, I think there's a big push to do more defense, to build up the Defense Department. Why? What are you going to focus on? You're going to focus on China. That's going to be the focus of that buildup. So for these are sort of counterweights. I do think ignoring allies and partners will be something Mr. Trump does for sure. And others will have to nurture these relationships in a way that will be not get his attention, I guess, or not be will be somewhat different than him. And so that will suffer. Those relationships will suffer as a result of that. But the attention to China as a danger, the attention to China as a threat to the United States, I don't think that will change. I think that's something that will be reinforced by the people will look at what Mr. Xi Jinping is doing with allies and partners precisely the way Professor Zhu pointed out. He's trying to weaken the United States in that regard, and so they'll look at it that way. I think we've reached that stage in the United States that when China issues come up, you're always looking for the angle. You're always looking for the negative thing that's going to come as a result of your initiative with your interaction with China. And so I don't think that's changing.
Great, super. Professor Sutter, I'm going to stick with you with another question. Let's move to Northeast Asia. And the question is for two questions. One question for Professor Sutter and then one question for Professor Zhu. The question for Professor Sutter is, how do you see the evolution of the U.S., Japan, South Korea relationship over the next 4 years? Obviously, it has been tightened significantly in the last 2 years. And so where does this go, considering how Mr. Trump was with Moon Jae-in and generally with regard to the Korean Peninsula in his first term? The question to you, Professor Zhu, is how does China really see what's happening between North Korea and Russia? And what do you see China's role going forward in the next 4 years with regard to Korean Peninsula related issues? What is China's stance going to be in that regard? But Professor Sutter, if I can have you go first.
I guess I would say the uncertain element here that's most important is probably the government in South Korea. In other words, the president there doesn't have the legislature behind him. The legislature is full of progressives, and their view of China is different than his view. Their view of Japan is different than his view, and in ways that are not conducive to the U.S., Japan, South Korea alignment. And so that will be getting in the way. If the president of that party gets elected in 2027, we could have a very different picture. And as it stands now, they control the legislature. So it's a complicated situation there. And the upshot is weakening. It's a liability to this relationship. It's an obstacle that has to be overcome. President Yoon is working this issue and seems committed to it. But this was something that Mr. Biden created. I mean, and Donald Trump is not committed to this sort of thing. So personally, are you going to get Donald Trump to sit down with the Japanese and South Korean leader and promote this the way Biden did? I don't think so. So you're missing that, and missing that dimension will weaken this relationship. I think there's enough momentum behind it to continue to develop the relationship, but I don't think it will be the high profile that it was in the Biden administration.
Professor Zhu? Yeah.
Okay, so regarding North Korea's participation in the Russian-Ukraine war, it's very interesting. I think so far, the Chinese have official Chinese government have maintained silent. We don't know exactly what the Chinese government is thinking right now. Some people say that probably China is not happy because Russia and North Korea are getting closer. Russia becomes the country that has the larger influence on North Korea. I don't know exactly what China is thinking, but I know that as Xi Jinping stated during his meeting with Biden, one of the things about the Korean Peninsula is that China doesn't want to see conflict spread to the Korean Peninsula. So there should be no conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So that seems to be a dual deterrence, a warning, dual warning to both North Korea and South Korea and the United States. So for North Korea, basically China doesn't want North Korea to provoke a conflict with the South. And for South Korea and the United States, I think that China doesn't want the allies to do something like a preemptive strike against the North. So I think that this dual warning from China has been kind of consistent. So the bottom line is that China doesn't want to see instability, especially war on the Korean Peninsula, especially in the context of Russian-Ukraine war. China obviously wants to have a more stable environment in its neighborhood. So I think China will keep a close relationship with North Korea, maybe keep a lid on North Korea, not to do anything stupid right now. But again, it's North Korea's decision to join the war with Russia. I think China is trying to stay away, trying to avoid this impression that China, Russia, and North Korea, and sometimes people say Iran, right, are forming this axis of evil. I don't think China likes that. China likes to be perceived that way. So I think privately, probably China is having a lot of dialogue with North Korea.
Great. Again, two questions. Let me go first. One question for Professor Sutter, then Professor Zhu. Let me spell the questions out. For Professor Sutter, it's just a very, very straightforward outlook-related question. Where do you see the situation on cross-strait and generally the trilateral dynamic in Taiwan Strait relationships playing out over the next couple of years, both from the security side, primarily from the security side? I know because you already talked a little bit on the trade dynamic and on the trade angle. And to Professor Zhu, the question to you is: suppose you were in Xi Jinping's shoes, and you talked about Xi Jinping would like to perhaps have a meeting early with Trump. What is the one or two important things that he would like to say to Trump or offer to Trump, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, how can he once again try to reignite that relationship with Trump and try to make it favorable with regard to Chinese interests? And so one or two things that you would suggest that he would say when he meets him early, if at all. But Professor Sutter, your outlook on Taiwan Strait matter issues for the next
on the security
2-3
side,
years.
yeah, on the
And
security
of course,
side,
will we have a war?
Yeah,
Because people keep talking war in
yeah,
2027. But so just on,
yeah, I just wanted to say, I think it was James Steinberg wrote a very good piece about how strategic ambiguity works and how policymakers have dealt with this issue over the years and why they have. And that's why we've had peace in the Taiwan Straits rather than war. And for 70 years, it's been a long time. And so the upshot here is that what doesn't get enough attention is the negatives for China if a war with the United States were to break out, and the alignment of countries that have recently seen Taiwan needing Taiwan rather than just Taiwan as a symbol. Taiwan was a symbol in the past, but now they need it for the high technology reasons, for the Indo-Pacific strategy, and the U.S. needs them, and these allies and partners need them from Europe as well as in Asia. So these are important factors that make me think war is going to be very unlikely in the Taiwan area for the time being. The impetus for defending Taiwan remains very strong. And it seems to me that shipbuilding and the Navy and things like that will all be increased under the Trump administration with what? With the justification of dealing with China. That's where you need these kinds of weapon systems. And so I think that's going to increase. I think the incentive, the imperative to move ahead with greater military support for Taiwan is very strong. The bipartisan committee in the House was really strong on this issue. And I don't think that's going away at all. So the Middle East and Ukraine will divert attention in various ways. But this momentum, I think, is very strong. And so I think that will continue. The caveat here is the president. If the president decides he wants to cool things off and wants a deal, then that would change the situation. I think I'd only give that about a 10% chance of happening in the next year or two because it's so unpopular. If he did that, it would be very difficult for him to defend it politically, even with his great power. And he would really challenge the Republicans in the Congress on this one, because they're very strong on this issue. So, so my point is, I think the momentum will continue. The arms sales will become greater. The contacts, the various elements that are used by the United States to show support for Taiwan will get more robust as time goes on.
Professor Zhu?
Okay, so for next couple of minutes, I will pretend to be advisor to Xi Jinping. First advice I think I would suggest to Xi Jinping is that, play on Trump's ego, play on his vanity, and remind him that we had a good relationship during your first term, so welcome back to the White House. We can restart our relationship now. And what do you want? We can help you, right? To reduce the trade deficit, for example. China can buy lots and lots of agricultural products from the United States. So does that help you to reduce the trade deficit? If it does, then we'll do it. So again, maybe Trump will be happy to hear that, right? So number one, just praise Trump for his strong leadership and try to renew this personal relationship. Second, I think Xi Jinping can also remind Trump that, look, you don't like war, I don't like war either, so maybe we can reach a deal in Taiwan here, right? I think one thing about Taiwan that has not been studied much is this concept, tail wagging the dog. We know that Taiwan needs U.S. support and protection, and Taiwan's strategic value will only grow as U.S. China rivalry intensifies. In other words, the United States also needs Taiwan actually in containing China. So is it possible that the DPP government in Taipei may take advantage of this soft spot on the United States and drag the United States into war with China that the United States, or especially Trump, doesn't really want to fight? So Trump can well, Xi Jinping can well tell Trump that, look, you have to be careful, right? Don't be dragged into this war unnecessarily by the DPP government in Taipei. And so maybe Xi Jinping and Biden Trump can work out a deal, at least for the next few years, to maintain peace. And that will serve the Chinese interest, that will serve America's interest. I think that's something that Xi and Trump can talk about. So those two things I would tell Xi to do.
Let me come to you, Professor Zhu, with reframing one of the questions that I see in the question box, and that is, it basically talks about, Trump being transactional, using Taiwan as a bargaining chip, essentially trying to get some economic benefits for the United States from China. The question is about US and China sitting together, US trying to extract economic gains from China. And if it does not get those economic gains, that it might then leverage the Taiwan issue from a political standpoint against China, and kind of arm it and be provocative in that regard. My main question to you is there going to be a kind of this cross linkage between trade and political and trade and security issues with regard to Taiwan Strait issues? What do you think? And Professor Sutter, please feel free to drop in on to answer that too.
Well, the Taiwan issue has always been so complicated. It's never been an isolated issue. It has always been a part of the U.S. policy towards China, towards Taiwan. So it's really difficult, almost impossible, to isolate the Taiwan issue from other, strategic, military, economic, and other issues. So that's why, Taiwan's value is very high right now with the U.S.-China competition intensifying. That's why, from China's perspective, perhaps, they can strike a deal with the Trump administration Because China for Taiwan for China, Taiwan is the so-called the core of the core interests. I don't think it is core interest for the United States. I mean, it's important, you know, but it's not a core interest. So I think China probably would like to explore that this vulnerability on the Trump administration to see if he's willing to make concessions on this issue, and if China can satisfy his major concern on economic issues. So that's why I said, you know, perhaps, you know, they can strike a deal, you know. But of course, whether he will actually do it, that's the big question.
I would just piggyback on that point. I think that for Trump, it's not a core issue. I agree. But for the consensus in Washington, I think it is a core issue. And if he does that, and he does it with Xi Jinping, who is viewed with no trust at all on the part of everyone else in Washington, then they'll say he's been had, and this is therefore something that has to be opposed. And I think he runs the risk of enormous blowback. The public opinion is really down on Xi Jinping in the United States. And the media is very down on Xi Jinping. So I think politically, it doesn't strike me that this is a winner. And Donald Trump likes to win. And in this case, I'm not sure how we can be a winner with this kind of a deal at this point. He may persuade people that this is going to have a great promise and so forth, but the record of the previous deal wasn't so great. And now you're jeopardizing fundamental security issues. And I just think it's very negative for him. And I think a number of Republicans in the Congress will stand up to him on this issue. I predict that. In other words, they are committed to this sort of approach. They're not going to just line up and do this. And they're going to say to him, why the hell are you mucking up our majority effort to get tax cuts, to increase spending? Why the hell are you mucking that up with this controversial deal with China? I think that's the bottom line that I see going forward in the next couple of years.
Great. We're into our last 5 minutes out here. Let me come to you, Professor Sutter, with two questions. One, a quick rapid-fire question is the story of COVID a story of the past, or will it, or the controversy of its origins will again resurface now that the administration has come in, and will that have some blowback for the bilateral relationship? That's question one. Second question, and I see that in the question box, is, there is this threat of downsizing federal agencies, and folks like Bureau of Industry and Security and all need to go into very, very granular stuff with regard to on export controls and all. So how do you see that downsizing process impacting the work of the day-to-day work in terms of U.S.-China relations?
On the COVID issue, I think, yes, I think that'll be revived. I think many of the Make America Great Again people feel very strongly about that issue. So I think that's going to, there'll be more attention to that issue, that it'll be revived. And the implications of that, China will look bad under those circumstances. There's no question about that. And the idea of, and Professor Zhu's very important mention of the whole role of Chinese Americans, Asian Americans in that situation, it gets back to all the negatives that were associated at that point. And that's a danger that we really need to pay attention to. And then the other point, I'm sorry, Shobha, if you would remind me.
It's about the downsizing of the federal government, how that could impact.
Obviously, this could have a big impact. I mean, if morale could be quite bad. And so what do you do if morale's bad? You go slow. You don't do it. You just sort of go slow. And how do you get people to go faster? Well, you need an army to do that. When it's pervasive in your organization, you really have a very difficult thing to do. And so I think that those that if it comes to that, if we have this clash of I'm going to fire you and this type of thing, well, fine, you're going to have a lot of dislocation then, and all that information will be lost. These people will be gone, and getting the job done will be that much harder. So I think, yes, implementation of policy needs these knowledgeable bureaucrats to do it.
Let me come to you, Professor Zhu, with the final question, just 2 minutes left. With regard to, U.S.-China relations have prospered when there has been a kind of a control tower person at a very senior level who's kind of organizing and managing the relationship and has that obviously are trusted by the president and delegated by the president to do so. Now, I doubt in the first Trump administration, there was nobody who played that role. What do you think, who could be that person? And secondly, what role do you think Musk might play, or is he too dangerous a player who could be a wild card, freelancing on his own and adding complexity to the relationship with so far as China is concerned? I'm sorry, the question is a little long, but if you could give me just a 1-minute answer on that.
Yeah, I thought during the Biden administration, Jack Sullivan is kind of served that role, in overseeing the relationship with his counterpart Wang Yi, But with Trump, I don't know. Right now, it's very interesting because Marco Rubio is still under sanction by the Chinese government. You have a situation where Secretary of State will not be able to travel to China. However, I think he and his counterpart probably can still meet in third countries. All the Chinese foreign ministers can still travel to the United States, so they are still going to talk to each other. But I don't know. Above him or between him and Trump, is there anybody else serving as this overarching role? And Elon Musk, yeah, he's really a wild card. I don't know his romance with Trump, how long it will last. That's also a question, So I don't see. I think he probably will play some kind of role in the relationship. Probably he's going to be on the more softer or moderate side because of his large business in China, in Shanghai, But I don't think his view, his policies will necessarily align with other folks in the administration. So his tenure in the administration is tenuous, actually. And I don't know how long he will stay there. So that is hard to say. I think most likely Biden will basically determine, what his policy towards China will be like, not by his cabinet members.
Yeah, got it. Thank you very much. I think there are still more questions, and there will be a lot more questions, of course, as the Trump administration gets sworn in. But I think this has been a very, very illuminating conversation, insights from you all. Thank you all. Thank you very much again, Professor Zhu, Professor Sutter, for coming on. And I want to thank you and wish you a good day. And I know you guys have to run, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.